Now, there's been a lot of stuff around transgender sports. The concept of transgender athletes competing in sport has been thrown into the spotlight in recent years. If you think about it, there's swimming, weightlifting, cycling, rugby union. They're just some of the sports that have been affected by the debate. Well, it comes news now that the World Boxing Council is set to establish a transgender category for 2023. The World Boxing Council plans to introduce a new category solely for transgender fighters in 2023. That's according to all reports. The sports will soon initiate a global call for trans athletes. So they're going to be actually asking trans athletes to come forward ahead of next year with the aim of setting up a fresh league or a tournament. WBC President Mauricio Suleiman believes that boxing needs to evolve for quote unquote safety and inclusion reasons. Now, they've been way ahead of everything before. Previously, they set standards on women's boxing rather than just let it evolve. And, because as you can imagine, there are rules, regulations, and what have you around it. They have set out to actually to form something for transgender athletes. Now, is this what transgender athletes really want? Is it a step forward? Is it a step back? There are many, many points of view, of which our next guest, Felix Fern, who we've talked to before, co-founder of the grassroots activism team at Trans Activism UK. Felix joins me now. Felix, what are your thoughts on this? Is this... do you think, I mean, I can't ask you to talk for all trans people, but do you think it's a step forward when it comes to trans athletes? Is this what trans athletes want, their own little tournament, if you like, or is it more about being included into the wider sport? I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
So I actually spoke with a lot of trans athletes earlier today. I gathered a lot of people on Twitter and had a conversation with them, because although I have experience in the trans aspect of things, not so much when it comes to athletics. And the overwhelming response is that it's just another form of segregation. We saw this originally with when women and men were separated in sports to begin with. It wasn't for the benefit of women, but more the concern that women must be in their own space. They must be separated away from men. And we've already seen, so women are already half the population, and they struggle in sports when it comes to representation, visibility, sponsorship. Now, if you take a teeny tiny percentage of people, which is trans people, they're going to suffer so much more. There's no surprise that they've had to do a global call out for athletes, because they're going to struggle to find them and then get them all in one place. There aren't enough trans people to justify segregating them and separating them out into their own category.
And I think that's something that's worth highlighting, because whenever we talk about trans issues, everybody sees us, all these people, what have you. We are, as you say, talking about a teeny tiny number of people. Danny Baker was Britain's first ever transgender boxer, transitioned in his 20s after being born a female, since has fought a handful of semi-professional bouts, but not licensed, according to the WBC. Meanwhile, in 2018, Patricio Manuel became the first transgender male boxer to compete as a professional in US history, defeating Mexican super featherweight Hugo Aguilar. So these have already been happening, but you're saying by forming this tiny little pool, it's another form of segregation. They're not going to get sponsors. They're not going to get recognition. They may not even be covered by the media.
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to boxing specifically as well, that's already a sport that takes body type and weight and condition into consideration. So why would you marginalize people further by making it more difficult for them to compete? If you're making a trans-specific category, you have to take so many more things into consideration. Are you going to be separating trans men and trans women? How do non-binary people come into that? Are trans men and trans women equal to fight against each other, when we know from hormones that isn't the case? So why would you continue to make the sport more difficult for those athletes instead of letting them compete in the body weight that they're in?
I have to just say, I love the fact that you're a trans activist, and yet you have had because not many people would do this. You've actually said, well, hang on, let me actually talk to those in the sporting world who will be affected. Because as I said right at the beginning, I think it's important, like people say, Black people or trans people, there are lots of different opinions on this. Yeah. So going actually to the people who will be most affected. So let's come to stick with boxing. As you say, do you think height, weight and category is enough from the point of view of trans people, the few trans people that there are, being involved? Do you think you're saying that those rules are enough to keep people safe and keep people fighting against people with similar weights and similar capabilities?
I do. I think that with all things, especially when it comes to sport, instead of having a blanket over people of separating people, you need to take individual circumstances into consideration. And that's fine. It's okay to do things on a case-by-case basis and have nuance. So some trans male athletes may not be as strong as others, and that's fine. You just have to monitor people and things like hormone levels. Sports already do this. There's no reason as to why a cis man with the same hormone levels as a trans man wouldn't be able to compete with one another. That's just something you monitor. Some cisgender men are not going to be as strong as other cisgender men in their category. That's normal. It's exactly the same for trans people.
Thank you so much for that. And the one thing I have to say that I think that this does is open up a conversation on a different line rather than for and against. We're now starting, please God, to get to the nuances and the differences and what have you. And if it's all that this does is kickstart that conversation, then good. I'm so glad that we've been able to have this conversation. So thank you so much again for joining us, Felix. And I know we'll talk a lot more in the future there.
No worries, thank you.
Felix Fern, you're so welcome. Felix Fern, co-founder of the grassroots activism team, Trans Activism UK.